Well, this sets the clock back a bit again. We've seen an uptick in activity over the last week and a half or so since the signing of the MOU on the 18th. There have been a couple of instances of renewed hostilities between the states amid that period. But with these latest attacks, we're back on the same cycle that seems to keep repeating itself and only getting worse and worse. And so the confidence of the shipping world, the confidence become a maritime conflict as much as the attacks have been on land. And we see that playing out in terms of the effect on the world's economy. This wouldn't be such a big issue if the Iranian control over the Strait of Hormuz hadn't proved to be such a detriment to the global economic activity because of its control of the energy sector's flow through that critical waterway. And it seems that the maritime dynamics of this are only going to increase because even as the Strait of Hormuz becomes itself more likely to be avoided, other areas in the region, including the Bab el-Mandeb and the southern Red Sea, are seeing a major uptick in the amount of piracy, and we're likely to see ships trying to go into the Red Sea again after several years of avoiding it because of the Houthis, only to bring back the volume of traffic that would afford potentially the Houthis another opportunity to resume their own strikes. And so this is a messy maritime picture that affects the whole world, even if the conflict remains localized to the maritime spaces in the Arabian Sea, the Strait of Hormuz, the Gulf of Oman, the Gulf of Aden, the southern Red Sea, and the Bab el-Mandeb. So it's a messy picture.
Iran has long relied on asymmetric maritime tactics rather than conventional naval power, right? Following these strikes, what forms of maritime retaliation concerns you the most? And are they more difficult to deter than direct military action?
Absolutely, and we're seeing in the Black Sea, the Red Sea, and now the Strait of Hormuz an incredibly important lesson, which is that it does not take a conventional force to have incredible impact on the maritime space. And we have learned that if we'd paid attention to what happened with the piracy situation years ago, with minimal firepower, with very low-end light arms and small weapons. Pirates were able to disrupt maritime commerce in the Northwest Indian Ocean, in the Gulf of Guinea, in the Strait of Singapore, the Sulu and Celebes Seas. And so now to have a very engineering-heavy country that has a huge amount of will to retaliate in a critical waterway, we're up for a real challenge because this asymmetry is likely to get accelerated in terms of innovation and become more forceful. And we've seen that with some of the attacks over the last 3 days, including the strike on the Qatari vessel that caused a fire on an LNG tanker that could still explode. And so we've got days ahead where the situation is extremely precarious, but months and years ahead where we have to be concerned about upticks of violence like this that affect the commercial maritime sector and with it the entire world.
In a crisis like this, commercial shipping often becomes the first indicator of rising risk, right? So what changes in vessel traffic, insurance costs, or naval developments would tell you that the situation is getting even worse or dangerous?
Prior to the conflict starting on the 28th of February, we saw about 130 to 160 vessels going through the Strait of Hormuz every single day in either direction. Now we are down to zero yet again, but we just saw an uptick, and a lot of people were celebrating the increase, but that increase was only to about 40 a day at most, sometimes 45, sometimes 50, but nowhere close to the pre-war levels. What that indicates is that there is a huge reticence in the shipping community. There is still barriers in terms of insurance. There are huge amounts of security concerns, and this is really focused on just getting the vessels that have been stuck out. We're not back to normal trade flows in any respect, and so what we see now is even greater reticence, especially after these strikes the last few days, because it now means that we're back to the starting point. And with the abandonment of the MOU, there's little confidence that things are going to become safe for maritime commerce in the immediate future. That means that we have a lot of work to do to go back to the drawing board in terms of agreements and ensure that there's some confidence building measures that indicate the parties are not going to continue attacking. And unfortunately, we really don't have any indication that that's the case at the moment. We have every indication that there's going to be continued strikes against merchant vessels, and that means that the insurance premiums are going to be high. The confidence in security is going to be low, and the likelihood of transits is close to zero.
Talking about the regional navies, what role are regional navies likely to play over the next few days? Could we see greater coordination between Gulf states, the US and European partners to resume commercial shipping?
unlikely, and the reason for it is that many states are afraid of getting involved in the conflict. Several of the Gulf states have been hit multiple times over the course of the last several months. Kuwait, Iran, Bahrain, Qatar, UAE. Others have seen incredible damage because of strikes, not just against the military bases that they host, but even against civilian infrastructure. And yet they have restrained, for the most part, with the exception of the UAE having allegedly been involved in some strikes against Iran. But they've not gotten involved kinetically in the fight. And so the majority of them are likely to be looking to see if there's any possibility of a diplomatic path, because I think everybody knows that right now the military is not going to end this conflict. The way out of this is not militarily. So they are very conscious of that, and it is more likely that you're going to be putting pressure on the parties to find the will to change their behavior and back off of the fight.
Okay, if Iran concludes it cannot match the United States militarily, does the maritime domain become its most powerful tool for retaliation?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it has been for years. Since 2019, we've seen Iran use the maritime space very carefully, very intentionally, and very consistently for sending messages to key interlocutors all over the world, including as far as Japan, Korea, and certainly the United States, Israel, and the Gulf states as well. But their messaging is often hard to understand, but it's usually clear who they're trying to target. It's just not entirely clear what they're trying to say at times. But in this case, it's very clear that they are going to continue using that forum as the means of communicating their displeasure, their confidence, their control to the rest of the world. And right now, they seem to think that they have the formula for a long-term ability to maintain sovereign control over the entirety of the Strait of Hormuz. Let's remember that the vessels they've attacked, having gone through the Strait of Hormuz, went through Omani territorial waters, very clearly outside of what is normally the international straits transit passage route. And so this is something that is far, far outside of any legal authorization. There's nothing that makes this legal. But in their minds, they are using the maritime space as the way of pushing back against the illegal assault on them by the U.S. and Iran starting on the 28th of February. And so this is a very complex dynamic that unfortunately is likely to have long-term consequences for the region and for the world.
How important is the information battle at sea with competing claims from Washington and Tehran? How difficult it is for the international maritime community to verify what's actually going on in such a fast-moving pace?
It's a fantastic question, because this is actually really important, and a lot of people aren't understanding that the statements of the president, the statements of Iran, don't match the behavior of the president or of Iran. And so we are seeing a real divergence between rhetoric and reality. That's been the case throughout. We've heard huge pronouncements by the president of the United States. Project Freedom, the Strait is open, we have peace, greatest deal of the century. All these sorts of things that made it sound like, as the great negotiator he alleges to be, that this has been resolved. Unfortunately, it's very clear that the devil's in the details, and there hasn't been much of a resolution. And so the confidence in his statements in the shipping industry has unsurprisingly been reduced. Additionally, the U.S. has been providing quote-unquote protection, at least providing an option of guidance through certain areas, and yet some of the vessels have been struck. So credibility on the U.S. side is unfortunately lower than it likely has been in years. On the Iranian side, they've never had credibility, and that is a problem. But ironically, we're seeing behavior that indicates that they're more trustworthy in some ways in terms of their threats and their follow-through on those threats than some seem to think that the U.S. is. And so this is a bad position for everyone to be in, where Iran is seen as a more frightening power, and the U.S., despite all of its heavy firepower that is being targeted at Iran, is not seen as a credible party. And that makes for a long-term messy picture that could be very difficult for the global economy to unpack, given the role of the United States in world affairs and world economic affairs.
The greatest threat today, not the strikes themselves, but the possibility of miscalculation at sea that neither side can easily control, as well as, is there a point of which protecting freedom of navigation becomes indistinguishable from participating in the conflict itself?
Absolutely. And that's why I think many of the foreign navies, including those in the Gulf and in Europe, that had said that they were going to come and help protect freedom of navigation are likely to back off and stay restrained, because that blur between protecting freedom of navigation and becoming a belligerent party to the armed conflict is too dangerous. And so you're absolutely right about unintended consequences and potential concern, because the possibility of a catastrophic event in the maritime space, even more catastrophic than what we've already experienced, is ripe. We almost saw the LNG tanker from Qatar come to the point of explosion because of the fire on board, thanks to the drone strike yesterday. If one of those vessels were to blow up, if an ultra-large crude carrier like the one that was struck Saudi flagged yesterday were to spill its entire contents, we're looking at intergenerational harm to the marine environment, loss of more lives, and likely a long-term recrimination because of the damage that is done to critical maritime spaces that would become unusable, at least for an even longer period of time than they already have been, and in ways that make it so local fishing, other activities, coastal recreational activities, and even life along the coast might become a much more difficult prospect, if not impossible one, for days, weeks, months, and even years, if not generations ahead. So we are in a very precarious position. And even today, we saw the U.S. Shrapnel allegedly hit a hospital in Iran. And so unintended consequences, accidental damage, catastrophic harm are all part of the picture when you engage in this kind of intense military action. And right now, we can't afford for the maritime space to be set back even further than it already is. And yet that is essentially what we're facing, and that's why many are going to sit on their hands until there's some kind of clarity as to what the U.S. and Iran are likely to do, and whether we can actually get to some degree of quiet to find a path forward.
Finally, my last but ruthless question, which expects a ruthless answer. In your opinion, what's that one development in the next possible 24 to 48 hours that would convince you that this crisis has crossed the point of no return?
I think if we see one of the other Gulf states hit in a civilian capacity such that they then decide to retaliate. Because what's likely to happen is then the entire Gulf community is likely to get embroiled in this conflict, and it's going to become harder and harder to find an off-ramp. The Iranian moment at this point right now is critical. What they choose to strike, because they are targeting right now, they're trying to decide what they're going to do in retaliation, is critically important for whether more states get drawn in, whether the U.S. and Israel increase potential attacks, and whether this becomes more than just another uptick in violence between the two states at war, or a much wider war.